MTC 5.20. I often hear parents saying that they feel guilty because they don't want to play Barbies or Transformers or Spider-Man, etc. You don't have to. We assume that we need to play whatever game our child wants to play, but children also love to be involved in grown-up activities. What seems mundane to us, because we have done it hundreds of times, is still new and exciting to our children. So take the time to involve your children in all the ordinary chores and errands that you have to do, rather than thinking that you need to get those tasks out of the way before you can relax and play with the kids. It's inevitable that involving one of the children in your own tasks will slow you down a bit. But you'll find that it's worth spending the extra time because you're taking care of 3 important responsibilities at the same time. You're completing the task, you're teaching your child valuable life skills that lead to self-reliance, and you're spending special time with your child. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.21. A crucial component of teaching effectively with metaphors is clarity. New York Times columnist William Safire emphasizes the importance of keeping metaphorical comparisons clear and simple. New York Times William Safire. Mixing the elements, he says, especially mixing clichés, invites ridicule. Safire cites language mash-ups from the 2008 presidential election that stunned voters as well as foreign policy experts. Safire 2008. In the metaphor mixer, you hear examples like "that isn't rocket surgery" and "he's cut out of the same mold." Safire continues. Safire. A radio show host once gave listeners a sinking feeling when he reportedly said, "I knew enough to realize that the alligators were in the swamp and that it was time to circle the wagons." Some of us might get the gist of these comparisons because we're familiar with such clichés. Others might stumble on the meaning or miss it entirely because the metaphors are as clumsy as Frankenstein's monster walk. If nothing else, these examples provide good justification for teachers to fine-tune the discordant discourse through intentional and effective metaphorical instruction. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.22. Social capital's importance to well-being cannot be overstated. A striking example of its power and thus, the power of relationships comes from Finland. Researchers noticed that, in one coastal province, the Swedish-speaking minority lived longer active lives than the Finnish-speaking majority. Although the two communities were similar in most respects, including genetic profile, socioeconomic status, education, and use of health services, there were remarkable disparities in morbidity, disability, and mortality. Swedish-speaking men lived 77.9 years on average, while Finnish-speaking men lived an average of only 69.2. 77.9, 69.2. The researchers suggest that these dramatic inequalities cannot be explained by conventional health-related risk factors. Instead, they point to indications of higher levels of social capital in the Swedish community, including more extensive voluntary associational activity, friendship networks, and religious involvement. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.23. In 1821, French astronomer Alexis Bouvard published a detailed table describing the orbit of Uranus as it should be according to Newton's laws. 1821 Alexis Bouvard. However, his observations of the planet soon showed substantial discrepancies with his table's predictions. The irregularities of its orbit suggested a gravitational pull from an eighth, more distant planet. 8. By 1845, two astronomers, Frenchman Urbain Le Verrier and Briton John Couch Adams, were independently using Bouvard's data to calculate where in the sky to look for the eighth planet. 1845, Urbain Le Verrier, John Couch Adams, 8 Bouvard. Telescopes were trained on the predicted area, and on September 23, 1846, Neptune was discovered within just 1 degree of where Le Verrier had predicted it would be. 1846923, Le Verrier 1. Its existence confirmed Bavard's theory and provided powerful evidence of the universality of Newton's laws. Bavard. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 5.0.24. The great social psychologist Floyd Henry Allport said socialized behavior is the supreme achievement of the cortex. Floyd Henry Allport. He was right. If you think about this for a moment, you will realize that the social world is our main focus, and it takes up an extraordinary amount of our time and energy. When was the last time that you were not thinking of something social? It shouldn't come as any surprise to you that most of your thinking is social. Why are they doing that? What was she thinking? Does he like me? I owe them a dinner. And on and on. It can drive you crazy. All these social thoughts are reflected in our conversations. Consider all those cell phone conversations that you overhear. Ever hear anyone talking about particle physics or prehistoric stone axes? Social psychologist Nicholas Emler has studied the content of conversations and found that 80 to 90% are about specific names and known individuals, that is, social small talk. Nicholas Emler 80% 90%. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 5.0.29. The natural sciences do not study entities that reflect on their actions and reason about them. Natural scientists and engineers care about where the object falls, the speed at which the chemical reaction occurs, or whether or not the bridge falls down. These realities are observable, and their nature is not clouded by the self-awareness of the objects, chemicals, and bridges. We cannot ask the objects, chemicals, or bridges to justify their behavior even if we want to. The matter of natural science is physical, and scientists can invoke a set of unchanging natural laws that operate on the physical world, acting as causes. The reality that is of interest to natural scientists is external and observable. They can know how close a model is to reality by measuring the behavior of physical things such as rocks, chemicals, and bridges. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 5.0.30. People tend to acquire rigid habits of perception, and one of the functions of art is to challenge these habits so that things may be seen with a fresh awareness. For instance, the work of Henry Moore or Graham Sutherland stimulates an interest in the suggestiveness of shapes, which makes us realize how one object can evoke many different things. Henry Moore, Graham Sutherland. Similarly, a study of Impressionist paintings makes us more conscious of the infinite variety of color change brought about by the play of light. Another interesting influence on our visual habits comes from photography. In the past, artists of the naturalistic traditions tended to avoid depicting familiar objects from unfamiliar points of view because this would have been unacceptable to their contemporaries. Since the invention of photography, we have become used to seeing things in unusual light conditions and distorted by foreshortening. On the other hand, the so-called infallibility of the camera often leads to the belief that the only true perception of the physical world is in terms of photographic images. Yet a portrait in oils can be a better likeness than a photograph. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. 5.0.31. Bacteria, like all other living organisms, live to multiply. They will produce offspring as long as conditions allow, and they will adapt their lifestyle to the local conditions that apply, as long as this is within their capabilities. Some bacteria have a very limited repertoire of lifestyle possibilities, so that you always find them living in more or less the same conditions, whereas others are real universalists and can be detected in a variety of environments. It would be silly to treat bacteria in general terms only, pretending they are all alike. A zebra is not very typical of all animals, especially if it has to serve as an example for insects, worms, and squid, as well as mammals. Likewise, E. coli, which is probably the most generally known bacterial species, is not typical of all bacteria. E. coli. We can only pay respect to the true nature of bacteria if we recognize their diversity. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.32. Many scientists report having key insights while engaged in discussion with colleagues, both those working in the same area, and those working in radically different spheres of human inquiry. Top scientists realize that scientific creativity depends on conversations, and they do all they can to create more collaborative connections. In the days before the Internet, biologist George Klein created a worldwide network of like-minded intellectuals, held together with old-fashioned letters and stamps. George Klein. After decades of such networking, Klein became a clearinghouse of ideas from physicists to poets, passing on letters to others he knew would be interested. Klein. The files of his correspondence take up dozens of cabinets near his office. Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, was inspired to create the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California, as a forum where diverse interdisciplinary perspectives could come together in everyday hallway discussions. Jonas Salk La Jolla Salk. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.33. Some species of mammals form social groups consisting of many individuals. Within this group, fighting is often limited by forming a dominance hierarchy. Within the group, each pair of individuals will come to a mutual agreement about which will be boss over the other. This agreement is reached during their initial encounters, and determines which individual will back down during future encounters. From then on, when that pair of individuals approaches an item of mutual interest, like food, the higher-ranking individual takes the item and the other moves on. If each encounter instead resulted in the death of one of the group members, then pretty soon there would be no members left and the species would disappear from the earth. When the members of a species do not fight to the death, then those members are more likely to live long enough to have children. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.34. Fleeing has been perfected to a fine art, inspiring mythic levels of speed, endurance, and agility in prey species. Plains animals, such as antelopes, gazelles, and zebras, have also learned to measure their attackers' talents against their own. Knowing that lions, leopards, and cheetahs are capable of only short bursts of speed, the hoofed residents rarely panic at the sight of a cat as long as they have running room and a head start. The important thing is to keep an eye out so the predator doesn't steal the bases and get close enough for a deadly sprint. Against hunting dogs and wolves, however, prey animals know they can't depend on their endurance alone. Canines are not as fast as cats, but they can run for a long time, long enough to exhaust weak, old, or sick prey. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.35. As a resource, landforms and landform processes can be a natural tourism attraction. One of the most well-known examples of a landform-based natural attraction is the Grand Canyon, but others include Uluru, also known as Ayers Rock, in Australia, the Rock of Gibraltar on the Iberian Peninsula, or the Fairy Chimney Rocks at Gorm, Turkey. Ayers Rock, Uluru, Gibraltar, Greem. Cultural values are often attributed to these landforms, and they are visited for that reason. For example, Mount Imei is one of the 4 sacred Buddhist mountains in China. Imei 4 sacred Buddhist mountains. Places where we can safely see the physical, internal, forces of landscape formation at work can also become tourism attractions. Arenal volcano became one of Costa Rica's most popular sites, where tourists witnessed the almost constant effusive eruptions with ash plumes and lava flow that occurred up until 2010. Arenal, 2010. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.36. Values and virtues reflect why and how you show up, goals are where you hope to arrive, and virtues are how you get there. When we practice living according to our values, we have a different quality of attention than when we focus on our goals. For example, you may show up in class to learn, value, while you aim to earn a good grade, goal. If your value is learning, you may choose a course that is difficult, and you may not necessarily earn a top grade. If you are goal-oriented and your goal is excellent grades, you might avoid the more difficult class. Your focus shifts, and your choices may shift too. If you value health and your goal is to lose weight, you might not experiment with risky diets. You also may think about health on a larger scale rather than narrowly defining it in terms of your weight goal. You may commit to actions consistent with the larger value of health, such as seeking medical care and facing appointments and tests with willingness. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.37. Industrialization was one of the key defining phenomena of the modern world. In Britain, the discovery of steam power inspired the invention of numerous new machine tools and production techniques. In turn, those new tools facilitated the manufacture of new consumer machines. New materials, cast iron among them, were responsible for dramatic changes in the design of products and the environment, making possible new forms of decoration. Those discoveries transformed the production of the traditional decorative arts. In textile production, for example, the spinning jenny and the jacquard loom revolutionized the ways in which textiles were both conceived and made, requiring designers to make decisions in advance of manufacture, unlike craft workers, who had been able to make aesthetic and material choices as they went along. That seemingly simple modification represented an important shift from the working process of the craftsman, who depended upon tacit skills, to that of the designer, who needed to engage in rational planning. It brought with it radical changes in many manufacturing sectors, among them fabric printing, ceramics production. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.38. Hope of a different sort is found in terms expressing the sentiment that life will somehow unfold as it is supposed to. Consider the Icelandic Petaredist, which Iceland magazine called the country's motto. Iceland magazine Petaredist. Roughly translated as "it will all work out okay," the phrase is commonly used as a rallying cry when outcomes are not especially promising. Many such terms leave the future in the hands of God or destiny. These include the Arabic Insha'Allah, which translates as "may God wish it," or the Russian particle avuz, which expresses faith placed in luck or fate. Insha'Allah avuz. Such terms do not convey assurance per se that a hoped-for event will occur. Rather, they assert that outcomes are predetermined, so there may be little point in worrying about them. Indeed, one might decide that any result is for the best, regardless of appearances, that events necessarily reflect some benevolent or at least unfathomable plan. Such beliefs can be a powerful resource, as Nada El-Taiba and Maria Harries observed in patients struggling with mental health conditions. Nada El-Taiba, Maria Harries. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.39. Psychodynamic therapies, including psychoanalysis, are based on extensive and sophisticated theories about human development, from infancy onward. The infant's development is understood in the context of relationships with others. Psychodynamic therapists have developed methods for increasing awareness of their own and of other people's feelings, in order to use the therapeutic relationship to help people to continue to develop. The theories underpinning these therapies were developed while experimental psychology was young, and they have not been amenable to scientific confirmation. Nor has it been easy to assess the effectiveness of the therapies derived from them, both because they take so long and because their goals are so complex. They have, however, provided therapists with a rich and fruitful source of ideas about emotional development and about relationships. Debates about the extent to which early patterns of relationships determine later functioning continue, but now have to be understood in the context of the proven effectiveness of other forms of psychotherapy. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.0.40. A set of cultural worldviews that have been studied extensively is how people approach contradictions. Compared with Westerners, Easterners are more comfortable reconciling seemingly inconsistent claims. Notably, Americans resolve conflicting viewpoints by selecting the one that best represents their view of the world. Conversely, East Asians use a dialectical approach to synthesize propositions and counter-propositions that Americans may deem inconsistent. For example, given two contradictory research findings, one more plausible than the other, Peng and Nisbet provided evidence that American participants tended to rate the stronger argument as more plausible when they were presented with both findings than when presented only with the stronger argument. Peng-Nisbet. In contrast, Chinese participants tended to rate the weaker argument as being more plausible when presented with both findings, indicating that they may have felt obligated to find merit in the weaker argument when presented with both findings. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.0.41-42. Most markets exhibit some form of imperfect or monopolistic competition. There are fewer firms than in a perfectly competitive market, and each can create barriers to some degree. A firm may own a crucial resource, such as an oil well, or it may have an exclusive operating license, which restricts other competitors from entering the business. Operating on economies of scale for a large firm may also have a significant competitive advantage, as it may enjoy a large volume of production at lower costs, which may further lead to the price leadership with low retail prices. Such strategy would also prevent potential competitors from entering the business. An incumbent firm may make it hard for a would-be entrant by incurring huge sunk costs with high-budget advertising. In view of such strategy, any new entrant may strive to compete effectively but may lose the market share if the attempt to compete would fail. The sunk costs are costs that have been incurred and cannot be reversed, such as spending on advertising or researching a product idea. They can be a barrier to entry. If potential entrants would have to incur similar costs, which would not be recoverable if the entry failed, they may be scared off. Another radical strategy may be used by the powerful firms to discourage entry by raising exit costs, for example, by making it an industry norm to hire workers on long-term contracts, which would build the escalated cost barriers for rival companies. Thus, firms can earn some excess profits without a new entrant being able to compete to bring prices down. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 5.0.43-45. A young man once went to see a wise man to seek his advice. The man was obsessed with worries that endlessly raced around in his head and felt totally out of his control. The wise man walked into his kitchen, picked up a large glass jar, and said, "Come, follow me." They walked through a narrow forest path and reached the banks of a river where waters raced over rocks in a series of rapids. "What do you notice?" asked the wise man. "The river is muddy and dirty," said the young warrior. It is endlessly racing by, churning over and over. It felt like he was describing his own thoughts. "Do you think you can control the turbulent waters?" inquired the wise man. "I would have to admit I couldn't," said the man. The wise man handed the younger his glass jar and said, "Here, fill this jar with some water from the river." When he had, the wise man asked, "Do you have control of the water in the jar?" The man replied, "I guess I control it, but only this small bit." The wise man smiled and began to walk back to the house with the man following. When they arrived, he asked the man to set the jar on a shelf. Then he asked, "What do you notice?" "The water is muddy and murky." Good, Keep sitting and quietly watching it for a while. Now that the water was still, the mud began to settle, the water gradually growing clearer. As he kept his focus on the still water, his mind too began to grow calmer and clearer. "What are you going to do now?" asked the wise man when he saw the worried man had observed the changes that came through mindfully attending to something. "Perhaps I need to take a walk by the river when feeling worried or troubled," replied the man peacefully, "collect a jar of water that I can set on a shelf at home and spend time quietly observing it." "Ah," commented the wise man. "However, it is not just the water that has cleared but also your own mind. You need to practice just quietly sitting and letting your mind clear like the water, even without a jar of muddy water." At this he nodded quietly and affirmatively.